Need to cover up the beard. Doesn't quite go with the hair. It's my beetle cut.
Well, you forgot the Brill cream.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's true. Used to use the beetle cream. 168 years. In the past, I tended to talk about the pioneers, the settlers, the people that created this church 168 years ago. As most of you know, they were from Scotland. They had to emigrate because of the Great Clearing, where the landowners basically took over all the tenants' properties and turned them into pastures for sheep. It was much cheaper to run sheep than to look after small little communities. Now, the tenants had two choices. They could either go to go to Australia or come to Canada. And a number of them came to Canada. And people like the Crawfords and the Arnott's and the Peets and some of the other names that we'll see in the cemetery as we walk around were the ones that came from Scotland, from the community of Ratho, which is just outside of Edinburgh. And Ratho means a village between two hills. Although when I was there, I couldn't quite figure out where the hills were. There was one kind of going into Ratho, but there didn't seem to be another one coming out. I guess you had to take a sort of a hawk view of Ratho to see where the hills were. And they arrived here about 167 years ago. And they first built their houses, cleared their land, and built their church. A very dedicated bunch of Scots. But I decided we'd talked enough about that over the last 6 or 7 years that I've been with you, 5 years that I've been with you, and that we should actually take a look at another group. And that was the ones in the 50s and 60s. And in reality, we're talking about actually after the Second World War. And one of the reasons was that there's so much similarity to what happened after the Second War to what's happening today. Once the Second World War was declared a victory for the Allies, the soldiers started to come back to their homelands from all over Europe. And they started to expect things would be the same as they were when they went to war. But much to their surprise, things changed during that period of time. And the factories, the retail outlets, the offices were all being powered by women. The roles that they had had prior to going to war were now taken over by females. And employers had to make a major decision. And they decided that they had to find a way to bring men into the industrial environment, so they let the women go. And the women then had to find new roles for themselves. Number one, being wives. For many of them hadn't seen their husbands for 4 or 5 years. And then there's a whole situation of restarting the industries. The armament industry was stopped immediately. And companies like Ford, General Motors, Chrysler had to redesign not tanks, not jeeps, not trucks, but passenger cars. Passenger cars, something that they could sell to the public, which meant they had to completely retool all of their plants, retrain all of their employees. The retail industry realized they had to find new ways to sell the products. Things changed. It was much like a few weeks ago when the Premier announced that the province of Ontario was back open for business. Companies had to retool. They had to retrain. They had to change things. Well, that just seemed to fit. Now for some historical information, I went to our historians of the church, Mildred, St. Clair, Jairus P. And I said, I need some information about what it was like in the 50s and 60s. Now let's get ourselves framed into what it was like in the 50s and 60s. Number one is the first TVs started to be sold residentially. My grandfather had one of the first TVs in Toronto, about 51 or thereabouts. And I was fortunate enough to be able to walk from school to my grandfather's house in the afternoon and watch great productions like Dick Tracy, who looked into his watch and talked to his friend. Who would ever thought that that was possible? And then after him came Flash Gordon, who had a thing on his back and he could go all around and fly without having to worry about wings. And there was a program called Howdy Doody. Anyone remember Howdy Doody?
I watched it every day.
Yes, I did too. Clarabelle the Clown, Princess Summer, Winter, or Fall. And the person that created it was a gentleman by the name of Buffalo Bob Smith, who actually had this program operating on radio for about 5 years before he tried to put it onto TV. And then for the adults, there was programs like Leave It to Beaver, Lassie, Bonanza, Have Gun, Will Travel, Rawhide, The Honeymooners, Proud to the Moon, Father's Knows Best, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, The Ed Sullivan Show, having people like the Beatles. And every Saturday night, starting at 8 o'clock, came Hockey Night in Canada with Foster Hewitt calling the game. And then, shortly after it started, they brought on another program at the end called My Pet, Juliet. Do you remember her? Yeah. Then on Sunday mornings, and it's interesting, the 50s and the 60s were the biggest growth of physical buildings, churches in Canada. Because the men had come home and had experienced things that they didn't want to talk about. And they realized how lucky they were to be able to return to their families. And it was just their tradition at that point, having every day that they weren't in fighting on the fields and having gone to church parades with the Padres, that they felt that they needed to worship, to thank God for bringing them home safe. And churches expanded all across North America. When I grew up in Scarborough, we went there in 57, our church had just been built. And it was magnificent. Huge sanctuary, had a big Christian education wing, had a big gym. It was about the size of a small school. In fact, it might have even been bigger than the public school I attended, H.A. Halbert Public School. It was incredible, the plant that we had. Here, people came back. Likely numbers didn't drop off the same, because not as many men actually left for the war, because they had farm responsibilities, and that was recognized as a primary concern by the government. But some of the lay leaders were Norman Hepworth. He was the treasurer. He was also the caretaker for the church, along with the Goforth sisters. Now, offering was taken up by different people who were voted on annually at the annual meeting. It was a responsibility, and it needed the full congregation's approval. They would have been people like James Peat, James Pettigrew, Thomas Arnott, John McNary, Lauren Peat, just to name a few. It would seem that from 1939 through the 1950, Mrs. Hannah Leach was the leader of a group of young children known as the Mission Band. And they would meet together on Saturday afternoons and play some games and tell stories of mission experiences and Bible stories and crafts, go on picnics, go fishing. And a small fee was collected to buy the needed supplies. And I found this most interesting, that most of these gatherings were actually at the home of Mrs. Leach. Now, as far as worship was concerned, children would start out in the sanctuary. There would then be a time for children's story. I must tell you that when I've done supply, this is the one part of the service I enjoy the most, is meeting with the children and telling children's stories. My grandfather, as many of you know, was a Methodist United Church minister. He said that he felt he got his best message across to the congregation in telling his children's stories. They were alert for that, but they weren't alert for the sermon. After the children's service, the children would go, and this would have been back when there was space at the back of the church. They would have gone to the back, and they would have had their Sunday school time. And in the 40s, actually, 3 or 4 dividers were bought and were set up to make classrooms. During Sunday school, it was expected that you would be given either a verse of the Bible or a part of the catechism that you were to take home and memorize and have ready when you came back to church the following Sunday. In the 50s, the basement was installed. Teachers and children then went downstairs to the basement for story after story time. And there were curtains put up in the basement to divide into classes. And the small children were taught in the kitchen. That was the 50s, an active time here in this church. And then the 60s. Do you remember the 60s? TV had the Addams Family, Andy Griffith, the Avengers, Batman, Beverly Hillbillies, Bewitched, the Brady Bunch, Dick Van Dyke, Dragnet, Flipper. One of my favorites was Get Smart and the Cone of Silence. Gomer Pyle, Green Acres, Hogan's Heroes, Hawaii Five-0, Book 'em, Dano. I Love Lucy, Marcus Welby, MD, Mission Impossible, Mr. Ed. Do you remember Mr. Ed? Ed was a horse that could talk. My Favorite Martian, Petticoat's Junction, and the first series of Star Trek, and My Three Sons. Some great TV shows during that time. Here at Ratho,